They made her stand on a broken crate outside the Red Ace saloon while the wind lifted grit off the street and stuck it to her lips. No one bothered with a platform. This wasn't cattle or horses, and it wasn't charity either. It was a quick settlement before sundown, the kind of thing men did when they owed too much and drank even more. She kept her chin steady, though the rope around her wrists bit raw where the skin had already split. A dress that had once been Sunday clean clung to her like damp paper. The crowd smelled of smoke, wool, leather, and a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. The man shouting bids wore a church coat and a gambler's grin. He called her the girl, as if that made it easier. He said her name only when the sheriff drifted closer. Nora Finch, he announced like a shopkeeper reading off a ledger. Debt inherited from her household. Room, board, and damages owed to Mr. Pike of the Red Ace. We'll take a work bond for the sum. 6 months if you feed her, more if you don't. Laughter ran along the porch rails and down the steps. Coins clicked. Someone whistled a tune that might once have been cheerful. Nora steadied her breath and looked at the horizon where the hills were the color of iron. If she stared out far enough, the faces in front of her blurred. She could almost hear her mother's voice telling her to keep her spine straight, to make no sound that could be twisted into weakness. Her mother had been gone a year now, the house sold for taxes, the garden trampled by a livery that promised to pay and never did. The debt wasn't hers, but debts never cared about truth. They cared about signatures and who woke early enough to catch a girl alone. She didn't look toward Mr. Pike because looking made her stomach turn. He had that way of smiling without warmth, like a knife under a napkin. He held her stepfather's IOU between 2 fingers and wagged it toward the crowd. She works clean, he said. Reads numbers. Keeps quiet. You'll have your coin back in half a year if you keep her busy and away from mirrors. The men on the porch chuckled again. Nora pressed her teeth together so hard her jaw ached. A rider clattered past and kept going, dust spinning up behind him. Farther down, a boy tossed stones at a tin can and missed more than he hit. The town moved on while she waited for her life to be reduced to a number that suited someone else's pocket. The sheriff didn't meet her eyes. He folded his arms and studied the sky like he expected rain, even though the clouds had burned off before noon. He'd come by the boarding room that morning to tell her it would go easy if she didn't fight. She had nodded as if he'd offered advice rather than a warning. You'll want to see her hands, the auction man said. No pox, no tremor, no scars that matter. He lifted her wrists. The crowd leaned in. Nora looked past them, past the hitching posts and the paint-flaked hotel sign, toward the rocks that rose like old bones outside town. Beyond those rocks, a river worked its way through red stone and cottonwoods. She had planned to follow it west. She had a bag under the bed with a bit of bread, folded into a cloth, and a Bible that still smelled faintly of soap. She had written down 3 names of towns where a woman might slip into work without questions. The bag and the plan were both gone now, swallowed by a debt written in a hand that wasn't hers. $10 to start, Mr. Pike called. A man gets a week of laundry out of that much alone. A plump rancher in a beaver hat lifted 2 fingers. A miner with black dust in his eyebrows offered 12. The banker's clerk nudged his spectacles up his nose and said 13. For office tidying twice a day. Someone shouted that she'd fetch more if she smiled. Nora didn't. 18, 19, 20. The numbers climbed like rungs nailed to a wall she couldn't see over. With each bid, the men's voices grew lighter, as if the coins came from a barrel that never emptied. She counted her heartbeats to keep them from skipping. Her mouth had gone dry, tongue stuck like paper to the roof. She wished for water and then wished she hadn't. Wishing made the distance between this moment and any other feel like a canyon with no bridge. 23, the beaver hat said, pleased with himself. He was already calculating the hours she'd scrub his shirts, already tasting the roast she'd cook on Sundays. The miner scowled and spat and gave up. The clerk reached for his wallet and hesitated when the banker coughed. Men are brave until the man who signs their pay clears his throat. The clerk stepped back. Going once, Mr. Pike sang. He checked the street, looked over the heads of the crowd, timed his show like a circus man. Going twice. Hold, the sheriff said under his breath. The crowd shifted. A stranger had stopped near the rail, hat brim low, dust like flour on his coat. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention on purpose. He stood a little sideways as if shadows were safer than sun. One shoulder sat lower than the other, a relic of an injury that had never healed right. He had the look of a rider who didn't know what a bed felt like when winter came through. Nora felt something like recognition, and then told herself she was wrong. She didn't know him. She didn't know anyone here well enough to be saved. The auction man kept his smile in place, but his eyes scanned the newcomer with a different kind of calculation. "You want to look, sir? We're nearly done." The stranger didn't answer. He lifted his head a fraction, and Nora saw a face that belonged to another life. Wind swept the dust away for a second, and the years fell with it. A scar tugged at his jaw where it met the beard, a pale line she remembered without wanting to. The angle of his nose, the way his mouth rested when he wasn't speaking, the set of his shoulders when a fight brewed. All of it returned to her at once, like the smell of rain after a season of drought. Elias Hart. No one in town knew that name the way she did, not anymore. It had been 4 years since he rode off from her mother's yard with a promise to send word and a small canvas bag of cash that never arrived. Folks had said he'd taken the money for himself, that he'd left because her stepfather had caught him cheating at cards, that he was all dust and bad fortune and a talent for disappearing. Nora had believed at least half of it because believing kept her from remembering the nights he'd sat on the stoop and fixed harness buckles with a patience that made the air softer. He had been the last person she trusted before trust turned into a story people told to make you feel foolish. Seeing him now felt like touching a stove you'd forgotten was hot. He looked at her the way a man looks at a grave he didn't expect to find, with pain that wasn't loud. If she had been free to move, she would have stepped back. If she had been free to speak, she would have asked him why he'd come and why he'd never written, and whether the river beyond the rocks still carried the same green light at late afternoon. But she wasn't free to do any of that. The rope bit again. The coat-sleeved arm of Mr. Pike blocked half her view. The beaver-hatted rancher cleared his throat as if to claim what he'd paid for, with an extra ounce of dignity. "Going twice," the auction man said more firmly, eager to close it before the stranger complicated things. A coin flicked in his palm, a little routine he used when he wanted the crowd to feel that everything was honest. Nora didn't pray. She had used up her prayers this year. She watched Elias instead and willed him to look away. If he bought her, it would be a mercy wrapped in humiliation. If he walked past, it would be proof that the last good things she remembered had never been real. He shifted his weight and lifted his hand. The crowd's sound thinned. Mr. Pike's smile sharpened. The sheriff let out the breath he'd been holding and looked at the dirt. Nora's vision blurred at the edges. She caught the shape of Elias's palm, the scar that cut across it like a pale river. She remembered the day he got it, the way he laughed when the knife slipped while he was carving a whistle for her little brother, the way he wrapped his own hand quick and hid the blood so her mother wouldn't worry. The memory landed in the hollow space behind her ribs and ached. 25, he said, voice rough from dust and silence. It sounded like gravel over creek bed, like winter talk made to last. The beaver hat man bristled and added 50 cents to his last bid out of pride rather than desire. Elias didn't pause. 30. His eyes didn't leave Nora's face. He wasn't pleading, and he wasn't daring. He was stating a fact he intended to make true. Mr. Pike liked the turn. He rolled his shoulders as if the price had risen on purpose. 30 once, he sang. 30 once and rising. He pitched his voice for the rancher, coaxing another try, but pride had limits and the beaver hat had reached his. The clerk's spectacles flashed in the sun and then tilted down again. The miner had wandered off to find a drink. 30 going twice, Mr. Pike said, relishing the last word. He would sign a receipt, gust some gratitude toward the sheriff, and pour himself a whiskey to celebrate the way a man celebrates arithmetic layered over cruelty. The world narrowed to the space between Elias's hand and hers. He had not come close, had not spoken her name, had not offered any reason she should trust him again. He stood steady, as if standing itself was a promise. And yet he was the last man she had allowed herself to believe once, and it had broken her in a way that never quite healed. "Sold," the auction man snapped, palm slapping coin to skin. The rope fell away a minute later, but Nora felt it burn even after the fibers left her wrists. Elias didn't step forward. He waited, hat still low, as if he knew she might flee if he moved. Mr. Pike pushed a paper into his hand with a laugh that said he'd just converted a nuisance into money. The sheriff cleared his throat again and told everyone to go on about their business. The crowd loosened, drifted, settled back into the afternoon like nothing of consequence had happened at all. Nora drew in one thin breath and then another. The town came back into focus. The wind lifted a page of newspaper and pasted it to the saloon wall, where it fluttered like a trapped bird. Elias tucked the receipt away and finally raised his head enough for her to see his eyes. They were the same shadowed gray they had been when he left, the color of sky right before it breaks into rain. "Miss Finch," he said quietly. No claim, no endearment, no apology yet, only a name, spoken like a door he would not enter without being asked. Her throat worked around words that wouldn't line up. The last time she had seen him, he had promised a future he never delivered. Now he was the one thing standing between her and a house where work would wear her thin and men would speak to her like furniture. She felt the old hurt and the new relief collide in the middle of her chest. "What do you want with me, Mr. Hart?" she asked, steady as she could make it. The wind shifted again. Dust slid along the porch boards. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her wrists where the rope had rubbed them raw, then at the road that headed out of town, then back at her face as if weighing something heavier than coin. "To pay a debt," he said at last, voice low enough that only she would hear. "Not yours." Before she could shape a reply, he turned a fraction and offered his hand. Not to claim, not to pull, simply to help her down from the crate that had been used to display her like a thing. She looked at the palm with the pale scar and felt the ground tilt. The last man she had trusted stood waiting, as worn as the country itself, and for the first time all day, she wasn't sure whether to run or to reach. The crowd broke apart the way smoke does when wind cuts through. Men drifted back towards saloons, hitching posts and poker tables, muttering about luck in fools' pockets. Nora stepped down from the crate without touching his hand, though she felt his presence as steady as the ground beneath her boots. The rope marks throbbed raw. She cradled her wrists close, unwilling to show pain, unwilling to give him anything she didn't choose. Elias moved ahead, cutting a path through the street without speaking. He didn't look back, didn't ask if she followed. That unsettled her more than if he demanded obedience. Silence gave her choices, and choices had been stripped from her for so long that they felt heavier than iron. She glanced once toward the Beaver Hat rancher, still muttering near the saloon, but the man's eyes avoided hers. He had lost, and losers carried their shame elsewhere. The sheriff tipped his hat half-heartedly as she passed. "It'll go easier if you keep on with him now," he muttered, though it sounded more like an apology than advice. She said nothing. Words felt brittle in her mouth. At the hitching rail, Elias untied a bay gelding and swung into the saddle. Without looking at her, he reached down, offered a hand. For one heartbeat, she thought about turning away, about walking until her legs collapsed, about letting the prairie take her in, like a secret too small for men's debts. But the day had already claimed everything from her. Dignity, safety, even the right to say no. She placed her hand in his. His grip was rough, scarred, but steady. He lifted her behind him as if she weighed no more than a sack of grain. The horse shifted under their combined weight, then moved out at Elias's nudge. The town receded behind them, the leaning hotel, the painted saloon doors, the warped church bell that rang crooked on Sundays. Dust rose in pale ribbons beneath the hooves, drifting back into her face. She closed her eyes against it, pressed her hands to her skirt to keep them from clinging to him. The sun sagged west, laying long shadows over the land. Hours stretched like rope pulled taut. She listened to the rhythm of hooves, the occasional creak of leather, the low sound of Elias clearing his throat when dust caught there. He did not ask her questions, and for that she was grateful. Answers were sharp things, and she wasn't ready to bleed again. By the time they reached the valley, the sky had softened to bruised purple. Ahead, a cabin stood beneath cottonwoods, logs fitted square, roof patched but solid. Smoke curled from the chimney, faint but real. Fences framed the yard, and a lantern glowed near the barn door. This wasn't ruin or ruinous wealth. It was survival made into shape and shelter. Elias dismounted, then reached up for her. She hesitated again, then slid down without taking his hand. Her boots sank into earth that smelled faintly of grass and wood smoke. She swayed from fatigue but caught herself before he could steady her. She wouldn't give him that. He lifted her suitcase. When had he picked it up? And carried it into the house. She lingered on the porch, heart knocking against her ribs, the weight of silence between them louder than any threat. Finally, she stepped inside. The cabin was spare but ordered. A table scarred by knives and years sat near the hearth. 2 chairs pulled close. A quilt draped over the rocker, frayed but mended. Shelves held jars of beans, dried herbs, strips of jerky. The fire burned low, casting shadows across walls that had seen no laughter in years. Elias set her case by the stair and went straight to the stove. He didn't ask what she wanted. He didn't ask who she was to him now. He poured water into a pot, dropped in dried carrots, strips of venison. The smell rose slowly, filling the small room. Her stomach twisted. She hated that he could hear it, hated that hunger betrayed her, even when her heart refused. She sat at the table because standing seemed defiance, and she was too tired for defiance. Minutes stretched. Then he set a bowl before her. "Eat," he said simply. She lifted the spoon with stiff fingers. The broth burned her tongue, but warmth spread down to her stomach, curling there like a fragile flame. She tried not to devour it, tried to keep the sound of the spoon from betraying how starved she was. He sat across from her, but did not eat. He watched the fire instead, his profile steady, unreadable. When the bowl was empty, he rose and pointed toward the stairs. "Room's at the end," he said. Her throat felt tight, but she forced out, "Why?" His head turned slightly, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim still not removed. "Because you were standing on a crate," he said, "and you shouldn't have been." Nothing more. No apology for the years, no explanations for silence, no claim of friendship or memory. Just a plain sentence left between them, like wood stacked for a fire that might or might not be lit. She climbed the stairs, the boards groaning under each step. The room was small, a bed with a patchwork quilt, a basin of water, a single candle stub on the stand. It was more than she had expected. It was mercy wrapped in silence. She closed the door and leaned against it, her breath shaking. The rope had been cut. The debt was no longer on her shoulders. But freedom didn't feel like freedom here. It felt like waiting in the dark, listening to a man's quiet footsteps moving across the floor below, and wondering whether the last person she had trusted had come back to save her or to break her again. The morning light slipped through the cabin's single window, pale and cold, settling across the floorboards like a thin sheet of frost. Nora woke tangled in the quilt, every muscle sore from weeks of fear and days of hunger. For a long while she just lay there listening. Downstairs came the dull rhythm of wood being split, the scrape of an axe against the block, and the hollow thud of logs dropped into a pile. The sounds were steady, certain. She rose slowly, splashed water on her face from the basin, and caught her reflection in the cracked mirror nailed to the wall. A stranger stared back, eyes hollowed, hair dulled, skin drawn tight across bones. She tied it back anyway, trying to look less like the woman who had stood on a crate in front of a crowd. When she stepped into the main room, Elias was already at the stove, sleeves rolled, hands blackened with soot and pine resin. He didn't glance at her. He just poured coffee into a chipped mug and set it on the table without a word. The smell filled her chest before the warmth touched her hands. She wrapped her fingers around the cup, whispering, "Thank you," but he gave no reply. Their silence stretched across the room like a fence. She drank carefully, watching him from the corner of her eye. He moved with purpose, every gesture practiced, like a man who had done this alone for too many years. When he sat to eat, he placed a plate in front of her as well. Cornbread, a strip of bacon, beans reheated from last night. She ate slowly, though her body begged for more, unwilling to let him see her need. After breakfast, he rose, pulled on his coat, and said simply, "Barn." He left the door open behind him. She lingered at the table, debating whether to follow. The silence of the cabin pressed heavy, so she wrapped the scarf tighter around her shoulders and stepped outside. The air was sharp, clean, carrying the smell of pine and thawing earth. Elias was at the corral, mending a broken rail with nails pulled from a pouch at his belt. She stopped a few feet away, unsure if he wanted her there. He didn't tell her to leave. That was enough. She moved toward the woodpile and picked up the smallest log. It was rough in her hands, splinters catching her skin, but she carried it to the side of the cabin. Then another, then another. Her arms ached, but she kept stacking, steady and stubborn. By the time she turned, Elias was watching her. "You don't have to," he said. His voice was low, quiet as gravel. "I can't sit and do nothing," she answered, sharper than she meant. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once and turned back to the rail. No smile, no thanks, but he hadn't stopped her. That felt like something. The days fell into a rhythm. She cooked what little he gave her, mended torn shirts with thread pulled from her case, fed chickens that scratched at the yard. He said little, asked nothing, but she saw his eyes flicker sometimes. When she hummed softly without thinking, when she tied her hair with a strip of cloth, when she stitched the torn cuff of his work shirt without being asked. At night she lay awake beneath the quilt, hearing him move in the room below. The scrape of a chair, the strike of flint, the low murmur of a man speaking to no one. Sometimes he walked outside, boots crunching in the dirt until they faded into silence. He always returned before dawn. One evening, a storm rolled in hard from the west. Wind clawed at the shutters, rain pounded the roof, and thunder cracked across the valley. Nora sat near the hearth, her hands clenched tight in her lap, every muscle rigid. Storms had always unnerved her, but in the dark of the plains, they felt like punishment. The fire popped, startling her so sharply she gasped. Elias looked up from the table where he sat carving a piece of wood. His eyes caught hers for the first time all day. "You're afraid," he said, not unkindly. She tried to shake her head, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. He set down the knife and the half-shaped handle, then rose and added another log to the fire. "It passes quicker when you don't listen to it," he said. His voice was steady, like the sound of water against stone. Nora pressed her lips together, fighting back tears she didn't want him to see. She turned her face to the fire, but in its glow she felt him closer, his presence solid and sure. He didn't touch her. He didn't try to ease the fear away with words. But he sat back down, nearer this time, his quiet a shield against the storm outside. For the first time since she had stepped off that crate, she felt the smallest thread of safety. Not trust, not yet, but something near it. The storm passed in the night, leaving the valley scrubbed clean. Morning light poured through the clouds, soft and golden, falling across the wet earth. Nora stepped outside with a basket Elias had left by the door. She bent to gather the hen's eggs, her skirts brushing against the damp grass. For the first time in weeks, the air smelled of something fresh, something alive. When she carried the basket inside, Elias was already at the stove. The pan hissed as he dropped bacon into the heat, the smell sharp and savory. He didn't look at her, but he noticed the basket. "Two," he said. His voice carried no judgment, no disappointment. She set the eggs down on the table, feeling strangely proud. They ate without much talk, though the silence wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the silence of strangers. It had softened, loosened, as though it could carry something unspoken. When she thanked him for the meal, his eyes lingered on her for a moment before flicking away. Later, when she stood by the wash basin, wringing out a shirt he had left on the chair, Elias appeared at her side. He reached for the bucket, wordless. His hands closed around the heavy pail, and he carried it outside before she could protest. She followed him into the yard. "You don't have to do everything alone," she said quietly. His shoulders stiffened, but he didn't answer. He set the bucket down by the fence, then wiped his hands on his trousers. For a long time he stared out at the horizon where the grass met the mountains. "You'll find that's the only way a man survives," he muttered at last. The words fell heavy, but she heard the fracture in them. The truth of a man who had learned the cost of leaning on anyone. She wanted to ask what had broken him, but she didn't. Instead, she returned inside and set about mending the shirt, needle flashing in her trembling hands. That night after supper, she found him outside by the corral. The air was cool, the stars raw and bright above the plain. Elias leaned against the fence rail, a lantern at his side, his hat low over his eyes. "You don't sleep," she said softly. "Not often," he admitted. She hesitated, then stepped closer, the hem of her dress brushing against the dirt. "What is it that keeps you awake?" For a long time he didn't answer. She thought he might send her away with silence. But then he exhaled, rough, as though forcing the words from a place he had buried. Her name was Anna, he said. My wife. She died with our child. Winter storm caught us. Couldn't get help in time. His voice didn't break, but something in it trembled, like glass under strain. Nora swallowed hard. She had not expected him to share this with her. The image of him in that storm, helpless, bearing both wife and child, carved itself into her chest. She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand where it gripped the rail, but she didn't. Instead, she whispered, I'm sorry. He looked at her then. His eyes were pale in the lantern light, weary but alive. Sorry doesn't change much, he said, but his tone held no anger. Only fact, only loss. She held his gaze, her heart pounding, and for the first time something shifted. Not love, not yet, but recognition. Two broken lives, each carrying a weight too heavy to name, standing in the quiet of the night. When he finally turned away, Nora stayed a little longer, staring up at the stars, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time since she had been sold, since she had been taken from all she knew, she didn't feel entirely alone. By late afternoon, the wind rose again, not with rain this time, but with a dry hiss that pushed dust along the fence line and rattled loose boards. Nora finished sweeping the porch and watched the horizon the way Elias always did, trying to understand what it was he listened for when the land went quiet. She didn't have to wait long. A narrow smudge of riders detached itself from the heat shimmer and drew a straight line toward the house. Elias stepped out as if he'd been summoned, shoulder brushing hers before he took the top stair in a single stride. He didn't reach for the rifle hanging just inside the door. He only pulled his hat a notch lower and stood with the stillness of a man who knew he could not outrun the next piece of his life. Nora felt the old fear wake in her, that powerless ache from the auction block, from debt spoken like a sentence. But it didn't take her the way it used to. She had learned the feel of her feet on this porch, the sound of her breath evening out when Elias was near. 3 men reined in at the gate. The one in front wore the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. He tipped his hat at Elias, then ran a glance over Nora as if adding her to a ledger. Afternoon, he said. Name's Vickers. I collect what's owed. You're at the wrong place, Elias answered, voice level. Am I? Vickers fished a folded notice from his coat, shook it open, let the paper catch the light. Nora Hale pledged against her father's note. Absconded. Employer holds right of retrieval. My fee gets paid either way. Nora's name in a stranger's mouth cut deeper than it should have. Elias's jaw worked once, slow. He didn't move toward her, didn't put his body between her and the men, and the restraint said as much as a barricade might have. He trusted her to stand. I'm not pledged to you, Nora said, surprised that her voice carried. I was sold like a mule and walked away still human. There's no paper that takes that back. Vickers laughed softly as if humoring a child. You can dress it pretty. The law's still the law. Elias took one step down, the boards creaking under his weight. The law also requires proof a note's valid, he said, and that a person was taken under it by choice. You got either? Vickers blinked, the smile narrowing. You a lawyer now, Reed? No, Elias said. I'm a man who's read enough to stop being cheated. Something like impatience flashed in Vickers' eyes. He nudged his horse forward a pace and let his voice drop. I don't need the girl's consent. I need her in my wagon. Nora felt the porch tilt under her, not from fear but from a heat that started low and spread through her chest. She took the rail in her palm, then let go of it. If you touch me, she said, the whole territory will hear you scream. The rider to Vickers's right shifted, half amused, half bored, as if he'd seen this scene a dozen times. But Vickers's gaze had already slid past her, assessing Elias the way a man measures a fence post. He must have decided a show of force would be expensive. He pulled his horse back with 2 fingers and smoothed the paper once more. You got till sundown, he said. She comes quiet. This is easy. She doesn't. Your barn's ash by morning. Your cattle scatter. And when we meet again, I won't bring paper, only fire. They turned as one and rode off, dust floating in their wake like a curtain falling. Elias stood until the gate stopped clattering. Only then did he exhale, long and even, as if he'd been holding more than air. Nora looked at him, searching his face for the anger she feared, for the calculation she dreaded. She found neither. She found a man running his thumb over the scar along his knuckles, thinking not about himself, but about the roof over their heads, the animals in the field, the small, ordinary things that made a life. "I can leave," she said quietly. "They'll follow me and forget you." His mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. "You think that's a kindness?" "It's a choice," she said. "The only one I can make that doesn't cost you." Elias shook his head. "You still speak like your life is a debt someone else keeps." He turned to her then, and the steadiness in his eyes anchored her. "You're not a line in a ledger, Nora. You're a person standing on my porch. That means your trouble is already mine. I don't want less of it. I want all of it, if it's yours." She had no answer for that. The words had weight and warmth and something she recognized from the way he watched the sky, the way his hand had closed around the bucket so she wouldn't carry it alone. She nodded once, unable to trust her voice. They spent the next hour like people who understood time had been counted out for them by someone else. Elias hammered a second bar across the back door and showed her how the latch set from the inside. He led the horses to the farther pasture and left the gate loose so they could bolt if they had to. He filled the basins and stacked kindling, not with panic but with calm motion, as if building small places for safety to hide. As the light thinned, he placed his rifle on the table, then set a shorter carbine beside it. He looked at her hands, then at the carbine again. "It jumps," he said. "Stand solid. Breathe out before you squeeze." He paused. "Only if we have to." "I understand," Nora said. She did. Yet there was a tremor of something else under the fear, a line of heat that felt like courage learning the shape of her ribs. They didn't sit. They took the porch together and watched the land darken from gold to iron. When the riders came, they came without hurry, as if the outcome had already been printed. Vickers halted at the gate again and didn't bother with speech. He swung down, tossed the reins, and strode toward the steps. Elias met him halfway across the yard, palms open, not as surrender, but as warning. "Turn around," he said. "You had your chance," Vickers replied. He lifted his hand and the men behind him started forward, boots scuffing, hands near weapons. The next moment stretched thin. Nora didn't remember raising the carbine, didn't feel the stock set against her shoulder. She only heard the snap of her breath leaving and the clean crack of the shot as it split the dark. A tin pail hanging from the fence exploded into sparks and fell smoking into the dust. Every horse on the line shied sideways. The men swore and grabbed for leather. Vickers went still. He stared at the fallen pail, then at Nora, then back at the pail as if reconciling the sight of a woman who did not shake. "I don't miss at twice that distance," Nora said. Her throat was tight, but the words landed. "I will not be hauled like freight. Not now. Not again." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Vickers's grin slid back into place, thinner than paper. "You got friends," he said. "Friends get tired." "You got a bluff," Elias replied. "Bluffs run out." Maybe it was the horse's restlessness, or the way the land itself seemed to lean toward the house, siding with the quiet it knew. Maybe it was the arithmetic Vickers did in his head, counting the cost of a fight that might be louder than he could afford. He spat, turned on his heel, and swung into the saddle without looking at her again. "This isn't finished," he called over his shoulder. Elias's answer was simple. "It is here." They waited until the riders were swallowed by night, until the dust settled and the great emptiness closed like a book. Only then did Nora lower the carbine. Her hands began to shake, delayed and stubborn. Elias reached out, not grabbing, just offering the space of his palm. She set her fingers in it and felt the tremor ease, as if the fear had only needed somewhere safe to go. Inside, he poured water and set it within her reach. He didn't praise the shot. He didn't make it a legend. He only said, "You did what you had to," and the quiet respect in it undid something locked tight in her chest. They slept in shifts, though neither found much rest. Just before dawn, a single knock sounded on the door, polite as a neighbor. Elias lifted the latch while Nora watched from the hearth with the carbine held low. Sheriff Mallory stood on the stoop, hat in his hands, eyes red from a night spent riding. "Got a wire from Cheyenne," he said. "Circuit judge reviewed a stack of claims from a certain employer who keeps sending men like Vickers to collect what the law won't give him." Judge says those contracts were made under duress. Says they don't bind no one, not here. Nora felt the world tilt again, but this time it tilted toward light. She pressed her palm to the table, then let it fall. Mallory shifted, awkward in the face of someone else's relief. You want this in writing, he added, passing Elias a folded copy, in case someone with more swagger than sense wanders back. Elias took the paper with a small nod. Much obliged. When the sheriff had gone, and the Dawn had finished rinsing the house clean, Elias set the notice on the table between them. He didn't touch it again. He studied Nora as if memorizing the way her shoulders dropped, the way her mouth softened, the way the corners of her eyes held on to the last of the night and then let it go. You're free, he said, the words simple and large. She laughed once, unsteady. I don't know what to do with that. You live it, he said. He hesitated, then added quieter. Maybe you stay. She looked up fast. He didn't look away. The space between them felt the way the sky does after a storm, washed and waiting. I could go, she said, testing the truth as much as the sound. I could take the noon coach and send a postcard from a city where no one knows my name. You could, he agreed, or you could help me fix the south fence and teach me not to burn the bread when you're not watching, and we could see if two people who forgot how to want things might remember together. Something like a smile moved through her, slow as heat through cold hands. I thought you weren't the asking kind, she murmured. I'm not good at it, he admitted, but I'm done pretending I don't want. She crossed to him and set her fingers at his wrist, where his pulse beat steady as a clock. I don't know how to promise anything grand, she said. I only know how to keep small things. Fire, water, a door latched at night, a voice when a bad dream comes. That's the only kind that lasts, he whispered. They stood like that, while the light climbed the wall. The day opened without fanfare. A hawk tipped its wing over the pasture. A hen complained in the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a creek argued with stones the way it always had. It felt like a benediction. Weeks folded into work and habit, into small mercies and the surprise of easy laughter. Vickers didn't return. People in town learned to nod at Nora, without the quick glance at her hands to see if they carried a chain. Mrs. Mallory sent cuttings for the garden. Elias taught Nora the trick of finding water by the taste in the grass. She taught him the patience of bread dough and the grace of letting a room hold silence without filling it with noise. On a clear evening when the air smelled of sun-warmed wood, they sat side by side on the porch steps. Elias turned a plain band in his fingers, thumb worrying the edge until it shone. It was my father's, he said. He wore it thin and left it to me, and I kept it like a memory I didn't know what to do with. He paused, then set it on his open palm. I'd like it to be a thing we use, not a thing I keep. Nora didn't reach for it right away. She watched the way the light took to the metal, how ordinary it looked, how honest. I was nobody in a book to men like Vickers, she said. I don't want a story that starts with a rescue and ends with a cage, even a gentle one. Elias's mouth lifted at one corner. Then we don't start there, he said. We start here, with what we choose. We can call it anything you want except a debt. She took the ring and turned it once, then slid it onto her finger with a breath she didn't know she'd been holding for years. It felt like a circle made of simple things. Work, warmth, the courage to ask and the grace to answer. Then we choose, she said. They didn't celebrate. They finished mending a halter and brought the milk in before the night cooled it. They ate bread and stew and watched the shadows draw long lines across the pasture. When the stars came, they came all at once, hard and clear, the kind that made people feel small in a way that comforted rather than crushed. Nora leaned into Elias, not as surrender, not as escape, but as someone who had found a place where her weight belonged. He rested his cheek against her hair and let the quiet do what it did best, heal without making a spectacle of it. In the morning there would be fences to walk and a stubborn gate to sand so it wouldn't catch. There would be eggs to collect and a letter to send telling no one everything, only that she was well. There would be days that went wrong and hours that carried old grief like a stone in the pocket. There would also be laughter drawn out by something small and perfect, like a foal's first unsteady steps, or the sound of rain finding the roof after a long wait. They had not been saved by miracles. They had been saved by choice, by steady hands, by the refusal to let fear write the end. That was enough. That was more than enough. And when strangers asked, years later, how a woman who'd been sold for a debt she didn't owe had ended up with a home that felt earned rather than borrowed, she would smile the way she did now and say only that the last man she thought she could trust turned out to be the first who never asked her to be anything but herself, and that in the hush of a hard country, they built something that didn't need permission to last.